Good evening and welcome to the Strand. I'm Christina Foxley, the Director of Events, and I'm so pleased to welcome award-winning journalist MIchele Norris, here tonight to discuss her memoir, The Grace of Silence. In The Grace of Silence, Norris blends the story of her childhood and her quest to fill in its gaps with a wider view of Southern race relations immediately following World War II. What's been more corrosive to the dialogue on race in America over the last half-century or so, Norris asks, things said or unsaid? Her struggle to answer that question becomes a powerful plea to readers to doggedly pursue their family's storylines. She reminds us that speaking candidly about race in America starts not at the president's teleprompter, but at our own dinner tables. In fact, MIchele invites you to participate in a little exercise. You'll find a postcard on your chair, and there are more in the back. If you would fill that out at some point tonight, you're welcome to drop it off with me, or you can go onto her website or email her, and both addresses are on the postcard, so we hope you'll take part in this exercise. MIchele Norris, host of All Things Considered, is co-winner of the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award for the York Project, Race and the '08 Vote, and was chosen in 2009 as Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. She has written for, among other publications, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times. As a correspondent for ABC News from 1993 to 2002, she earned Emmy and Peabody Awards for her contribution to the network's 9/11 reporting. She's been a frequent guest commentator on Meet the Press, The Chris Matthews Show, and Charlie Rose. Following her reading, MIchele would be happy to take your questions. I'll be walking around with a microphone, so please wait for that before you speak. And then she'll sign copies of her books for you, which you can purchase downstairs on your way out of the store. Please join me in welcoming MIchele Norris to the stage.
And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. You're going to have to excuse me because I'm going to scan all of your faces, because I want to remember all of you, and I want to remember this night. I'm a first-time author. This is my first book. It was published today. It feels so good to say that sentence. And this is my first book event. So this is a very special evening, and I'm always going to remember this and remember all of you for coming out. So thank you. In Christina's introduction, she talked about what I do on NPR, and most people think the most important thing I do is talk on the radio. Really, the most important thing I do is listen. A good interviewer is a good listener. A good storyteller is a good listener. And amazing things happened to me when I began listening to the conversation that was going on in this country. I believe that there was an interesting and robust and somewhat different conversation going on around and about and inside of race in America in the run-up to the presidential election and in the period immediately following the election of Barack Obama. And I originally wanted to try to capture that conversation. That was my original intent when I set out to write a book. I was going to write about other people and what they were talking about, and what they were thinking about. And I changed course when I began listening very closely to the conversation in my own family, and I started to hear some very profound things. Now, at first I thought, well, I'm going to continue writing the series of essays, and the stories that I learned would perhaps become anecdotes. I wanted to put an ear to the honest conversation about race, so I thought, well, let it begin with me. Let me be honest about some of the things that I'm hearing in my own family. I thought at first it would be anecdotes. And then I found that I couldn't let it go. I was working on this book about how other people talk about race, but I was spending so much of my time digging into these secrets, these stories that I learned in my own family. What started out as a distraction, canoodling over here when I was supposed to be working over there, became an obsession over time. And I realized that I was writing the wrong book, that I didn't necessarily need to write, for now, that book about the hidden conversation. I needed to focus on the hidden conversation in my own family because of what I had learned. And here's what I had learned. And before I share that with you, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, because it will help you understand why this was such a profound experience for me to hear these stories. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you listen very closely, you may detect a little bit of a Minnesota accent, the long O's, and it becomes very pronounced when I go home. I grew up on the south side of Minneapolis. My parents were postal workers. They were quiet, hard-working people. They worked long hours. They accumulated as much overtime as possible. I barely saw them at Christmas because for them that was an opportunity to make a lot of money. Between October and Christmas, I would be with my aunts and uncles most of that time because my parents would rack up as much overtime as they could when everyone was sending packages all over the country. I was raised by people who were quiet and dignified and absolutely ordinary. And that was fine with them. They liked being ordinary. That was, in fact, their goal, was to just be, an average Joe and Jane. I discovered that they were ordinary people who had extraordinary experiences in their past, and they did a very good job of locking those experiences away. In the course of covering the campaign, I was in Chicago, and I was having breakfast with my Uncle Joe. Joe is the youngest of 6 Norris men. My father had 5 brothers, 6 sons of Birmingham, Alabama. I was raised in Minnesota. He was raised in Birmingham. And I was in Chicago. And my uncle was very upset that morning because he does continue, in fact, to do a lot of work with young people. And he was trying to get young people to register to vote, and he was upset. He was upset because he couldn't get people to focus on the election. He couldn't get them to show up and vote in their own interest. And he was just fatigued by this. He thought if there were ever an election that would pull people out and get people interested, this would be it. And they weren't. And he was mad, and he was having oatmeal for breakfast, and he was shoveling in his mouth and fussing at me, and shoveling and fussing and shoveling and fussing. And at one point he said, your father was shot. Shot in the leg. I did not know my father was shot. Of course I didn't know this. And you could see when he said it that he wished he hadn't. When you say something and the words spill out, often it's when you're talking to someone that you love, you're talking to your spouse, oh God, why did I say that? I wish I could take it and pull it back. And I sensed that from him, that he saw it because of the look in my face that he wanted to take it back, but it was too late. And my father, it turns out, I learned, partially through continued discussions with him, with discussions with other family members, my father, I learned, had been shot in the leg by a policeman in Birmingham, Alabama in 1946. It was shortly after he returned from his military service. In World War II, he served in the Navy. He was a young man who returned to Birmingham, Alabama at a time when black veterans were streaming back to the city and returning as men who had transformed themselves in the military. They had come back and they were prideful and they had fought for democracy overseas and they wanted a taste of it back home and they wanted to vote and they wanted to participate fully in America, and America was not ready. It was a time when they were marching through the streets, when they were showing up and taking lessons in the Constitution so they could pass the poll test. And it was a time when many of these veterans were finding that America was not welcoming them as they thought that they should. My father was planning to attend an event one evening, and he ran into police officers who tried to stop him. This mild-mannered man that I knew in that moment after the war did something that seems completely out of character to me. He stood up to the police officers. A scuffle ensued, and the gun went off, and he was shot in the leg. It was a superficial wound. He was grazed in the leg. And so when I decided to write this memoir, this accidental memoir, I tried to find out what that meant for him. How it was that he went from this young man who grew up in a segregated Birmingham and who had experienced the sharp end of racism, had grown up to be a man who had this sunny disposition, who always had a smile on his face, who taught his kids to look for the best in everybody, who never spoke of that experience, who left it in his past like an old forgotten sock. He never talked about it. He never told his daughters. He never told the cousins. He never told my mother. He took the story to his grave. But it turns out that Mom had secrets of her own. My father went from Birmingham to Boston to Chicago and eventually to Minnesota, and he met and fell in love with a Minnesota girl. My mother is a fourth-generation Minnesotan. Hers was the only black family in Alexandria, a small town, and she had a secret about her mother's life growing up in Minnesota. My grandmother, Ione Brown, worked for a time as a traveling Aunt Jemima. And you're looking at me like, what does that mean? Aunt Jemima's on a pancake lot. She's a static character that is an artistic rendering, right? Well, in that era, there were people who served as spokesmodels. They were sort of like avatars of Aunt Jemima. They traveled around the country. My grandmother had a 6-state region in the Middle West. She traveled to Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, the Dakotas, and Michigan. She did pancake demonstrations hawking a product that at the time was somewhat revolutionary, pancake mix. Add water, stir, boom, instant pancakes. My mother and her siblings didn't talk about this because they were ashamed that their mother dressed up by putting on a hoop skirt and a headscarf and traveling to small towns selling pancake mix to farm wives. When I learned about that story from another uncle on my mother's side, that was another story that took hold of me and wouldn't let go. I had to know more. I wanted to know more about my grandmother's life. I wanted to know more about why she would take this job and what her experiences were. And in both cases, in trying to learn about my father and trying to learn about my grandmother, I got lucky. In my father's case, I found relatives who fussed at me, who didn't want to talk about it. I found relatives who slammed the phone down. Why are you asking me about this? I found other relatives who were so saddened when I called. Now you know. We hoped you wouldn't know. But I also found evidence. I found the police docket. I found the court records. I found much about what life was like for my father and for the other returning veterans. On the other side, I got lucky because I found newspaper clippings about my grandmother's work. Aunt Jemima's coming to town. That was the headline. Beneath that headline was a picture of my grandmother. A picture that did not in any way comport with the woman that I knew. The woman I knew was elegant. She always had matching ensembles when she stepped out, even if she was just going to the grocery store. Her shoes matched her handbag, and there was a little glove that hung out. Some of you are nodding because you remember this little pair of gloves that hung out over the purse. Not because I think she intended to wear the gloves, but it just kind of looked nice. She had a nice pair of gloves there, a little scarf tied to her purse. I had to think about what it was like for her not to just tie that silk scarf under her chin so she looked like Jackie O, but instead to take that scarf and pull it backwards and tie it up at the top of her head because she was trying to depict a slave woman. I had to come to terms with the fact that Aunt Jemima was a member of my family, that she had a secret place in my family tree. I wound up writing an accidental memoir. It's my story. But in many ways, it is all of our stories because so many of us have secrets in our family, those things that we don't talk about. It's not because the elders in our family are dishonest. It's not because they lie to us. That's kind of an ugly word. No, it's not. It's not something that's malevolent. It's because they want the best for us. When you send your children out into the world, if you truly want them to soar, you don't put stones in their pockets. And I think that that's what they thought they were doing if they told us the truth about their own painful experiences. They didn't want to weigh down our path or weigh down our pockets, I guess, as we set out on that path with their tales of woe. They didn't want our path forward to be cluttered by their personal pain. Now, in my case,